Before we move into the slides, let me frame the discussion in one sentence. Climate finance is not only about mobilizing resources for climate action, it is about deciding how global commitments are translated into real protection, infrastructure, livelihoods, and institutional capacity in places that face unequal levels of risk. That is why this topic matters for environmental planning. We are not dealing with finance in isolation. We are dealing with a chain that connects international rules, multilateral institutions, national planning systems, and local realities. As we move through the presentation, keep one idea in mind. A fund can look fair at the global level and still produce exclusion at the point of access or delivery. That tension sits at the heart of the topic today. Welcome to topic 4303 on climate finance and the Green Climate Fund. This presentation treats climate finance not only as a question of how much money exists, but of how governance systems distribute opportunity, shape priorities, and influence who is actually protected from climate risk. Our main focus is adaptation finance within global climate governance. We look closely at the Green Climate Fund, or GCF, because it is one of the key institutional arenas where debates about vulnerability, fairness, country ownership, and implementation barriers come together. Throughout the presentation, we ask a linked set of questions. Does adaptation finance really reach the most vulnerable countries and communities? How do rules and institutional design affect access? When countries are told they should own the process, what does ownership mean in practice? And how can climate finance support resilience in socially inclusive ways rather than narrow technical fixes? By the end, the goal is to understand climate finance as a planning issue, a governance issue, and a justice issue at the same time. The presentation moves through 6 parts. First, we explain why climate finance matters for sustainable development and environmental planning. Second, we define a few core concepts, especially the distinction between mitigation finance and adaptation finance, and the difference between public and private finance. Third, we place the GCF within the broader UNFCCC and Paris Agreement finance architecture. Fourth, we review evidence on allocation, distributive justice, and the unequal geographies of climate finance. Fifth, we discuss country ownership and barriers to local delivery. Finally, we synthesize the literature into practical design principles for more equitable and effective finance. So the structure moves from concepts, to institutions, to empirical evidence, and then to planning implications. This matters because climate finance debates often become abstract very quickly. Our aim is to connect the global governance architecture to concrete questions of access, implementation, and long-term resilience on the ground. The learning objectives for this topic go beyond finance terminology. First, we should be able to explain key concepts in sustainable development and environmental planning. Climate finance matters here because planning decisions are increasingly shaped by access to funding, risk governance, and accountability requirements. Second, we should connect ecological principles and spatial organization to urban and regional environments. Adaptation finance often supports resilient infrastructure, ecosystem-based measures, and service systems that operate across space. Third, we should describe how climate adaptation and infrastructure planning support sustainability. Finance is one of the mechanisms through which adaptation priorities become implemented projects. Fourth, we should identify the global and national frameworks that guide planning practice, including the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, and national climate strategies. Finally, we should recognize the ethical dimension of planning, including distributive justice, participation, responsibility, and stewardship. These objectives remind us that climate finance is not a separate technical subfield. It cuts across planning, governance, infrastructure, ecology, and ethics. Climate finance matters because climate impacts generate major investment needs, yet the capacity to respond is unevenly distributed. Societies need resources for resilient infrastructure, risk reduction, ecosystem protection, social protection, early warning systems, water security, and many other adaptation priorities. At the same time, low-carbon transitions also require investment, so mitigation and adaptation needs compete within limited political and financial space. The key point is that finance shapes which risks are addressed and whose needs are prioritized. Finance is never neutral. It filters and orders action. From a planning perspective, this means project design, evidence quality, institutional readiness, and strategic alignment all matter. There is also a clear equity dimension. Questions of responsibility, vulnerability, capability, and access affect who should receive support and on what terms. For planners, climate finance is not just money moving from one actor to another. It is a governance tool that can enable or constrain resilient land use, infrastructure provision, and service delivery. We need a few core concepts before moving further. Mitigation finance refers to investment that reduces greenhouse gas emissions. Common examples include renewable energy systems, energy efficiency, and low-carbon transport. Adaptation finance refers to investment that reduces climate risk and vulnerability. Examples include flood protection, climate-resilient infrastructure, ecosystem restoration, drought preparedness, and heat health measures. This distinction matters because mitigation and adaptation have different benefit structures, time horizons, and political logics. We also distinguish between public and private finance. Public finance can fund public goods, absorb risk, and direct resources toward priorities that markets would neglect. Private finance tends to follow expected returns and risk calculations. That means many adaptation activities, especially those serving vulnerable populations, cannot rely on private finance alone. Another important concept is additionality and tracking. What counts as climate finance depends on definitions, accounting methods, and reporting rules. These technical choices shape claims about progress, fairness, and ambition. To understand the GCF, we need to locate it within the wider architecture of global climate governance. Under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, climate finance is connected to legal commitments, multilateral funds, accredited entities, and national implementation processes. The Green Climate Fund sits inside the financial mechanism of the Convention and is one of the most visible institutions in this system. But it does not operate alone. Finance moves through an architecture that includes formal rules, board decisions, implementing intermediaries, national institutions, and local actors. In practice, this means climate finance is shaped by both international commitments and country-level capacity. A commitment in a treaty does not automatically become a successful project on the ground. Many steps sit in between, and each step can introduce friction. The architecture is therefore not only about mobilizing resources. It is also about who is authorized to prepare proposals, who can approve them, who manages safeguards, and who bears the burden of compliance and reporting. The Green Climate Fund is presented in the literature as a central dedicated multilateral fund under the UNFCCC financial mechanism. Its stated ambition is to support a paradigm shift toward low-emission and climate-resilient development. That language matters because it implies structural change, not just isolated projects. The GCF operates through accredited entities, while countries engage through national designated authorities, or NDAs, and focal points. It also uses investment criteria, results frameworks, environmental and social safeguards, and fiduciary standards to govern decisions. These features are meant to improve accountability and ensure quality, but they can also create barriers. The deck emphasizes two concepts the GCF is supposed to advance: direct access and simplified pathways. In principle, both are meant to reduce dependence on external intermediaries and make it easier for countries, especially vulnerable ones, to access funding. In practice, however, the evidence suggests that persistent friction remains. This slide simplifies the access pathway to show where bottlenecks often emerge. The process begins with country priorities, ideally linked to national climate strategies such as NDCs or adaptation plans. Then there is endorsement through the NDA and a claim to country ownership. After that, an accredited entity prepares the proposal, which then moves through technical review and board approval before implementation and reporting. This sequence reveals that access is not only about having need, it is also about being able to move through a demanding institutional process. Proposal preparation itself can be complex and expensive. Accreditation requirements can be difficult for national entities with limited administrative capacity. Fiduciary standards, safeguard systems, and evidence requirements can delay progress. The Simplified Approval Process, or SAP, was introduced to support smaller and lower-risk proposals, but simplification still has limits when underlying capacity is weak. Procedural inclusion does not automatically produce substantive access. The literature on transaction costs helps explain why access difficulties persist even when finance is available in principle. Transaction costs include the time, coordination effort, reporting burden, negotiation work, and monitoring requirements associated with moving resources from donors and funds to intended beneficiaries. Climate finance is especially vulnerable to high transaction costs because outcomes are often long-term, uncertain, and difficult to observe directly. Donors and fund managers therefore create controls and delegate responsibilities through multiple layers. But those extra layers can fragment finance flows and increase the burden on recipients. This produces a design trade-off. The system seeks accountability, but greater accountability procedures can reduce accessibility. For adaptation, this problem is acute because many useful interventions are relatively small-scale, locally specific, and difficult to standardize. A highly complex approval process can make such projects less attractive or less feasible. Reducing unnecessary transaction costs can widen access and make adaptation finance more responsive to actual risk conditions. One of the most important questions in adaptation finance is whether resources reach those who are most vulnerable. The evidence discussed in the deck suggests an ambiguous picture. On paper, funds such as the GCF emphasize prioritization of vulnerable country groups, including least developed countries, small island developing states, and African countries. Yet in practice, high vulnerability does not automatically translate into successful access. Countries with weak institutions, fragile bureaucracies, or conflict-related governance problems often face the greatest difficulty in navigating proposal systems. This produces a paradox. The places with the highest risk may also be the places least able to satisfy the procedural demands of the funding architecture. So vulnerability and capacity interact. A justice-oriented allocation system cannot stop at formal eligibility. It must also address the capacity conditions that determine whether the most vulnerable can participate at all. The distributive justice lens asks whether finance allocations reflect vulnerability, need, and fairness considerations. This is a more explicit ethical framing than simply asking whether funds are efficient or well managed. The research summarized in the presentation suggests that adaptation finance does show stronger links to vulnerability than mitigation finance does. In other words, adaptation allocations tend to be more responsive to need. However, the relationship is not simple or perfect. Some studies suggest that countries with moderate vulnerability may receive more than those with the highest vulnerability, especially when the latter also face severe institutional barriers. This means the justice story is partial. There is evidence that vulnerability matters, but not always in ways fully consistent with the strongest interpretation of distributive justice. Another important point is that vulnerability metrics themselves are political. Which indicators are used, how they are weighted, and how they are translated into allocation criteria all shape outcomes. Climate finance also has a geographical and political economy dimension. The deck draws on work arguing that climate finance can reproduce dependency if decision-making power, standards, and acceptable project forms remain concentrated outside recipient spaces. This does not mean all climate finance is unjust. Rather, it means that even well-intentioned systems can reinforce unequal power relations if intermediaries retain too much control over priorities, timing, or implementation logic. Funding rules may favor project types that fit donor expectations or standardized templates, while more locally grounded priorities receive less attention. Intermediaries can also shape what counts as evidence and how risk is narrated. From a justice perspective, this matters because affected communities may formally appear included while still having limited real discretion. A justice-oriented climate finance system would shift more voice, capacity, and discretion toward those living with climate impacts. Country ownership is often proposed as a remedy to these concerns. In the climate finance context, country ownership means more than symbolic endorsement. It means alignment with national strategies, use of national systems where appropriate, stronger accountability to domestic institutions, and more meaningful stakeholder participation. In the GCF architecture, NDAs are expected to coordinate actors, endorse proposals, and connect finance with national priorities. The case study literature suggests that NDAs can strengthen ownership, but only when institutional design gives them real leverage. If they lack capacity, resources, convening authority, or a clear mandate, ownership risks becoming procedural rather than substantive. The phrase paradigm shift is also important here. Transformation requires more than project approval. It requires institutional learning, pipeline development, strategic alignment, and the ability to influence sectoral trajectories over time. Local delivery is decisive because adaptation is context-specific. Effective adaptation depends on local knowledge, local institutions, livelihood realities, and concrete exposure patterns. Yet recent scholarship shows that the GCF still faces major shortcomings in the local delivery of adaptation finance. One barrier is conceptual. What exactly counts as local delivery is often unclear. Another is institutional. Access pathways are still dominated by intermediaries, and local actors may enter the process late or weakly. Reporting and measurement systems can also favor large, standardized projects over more distributed and participatory approaches. This creates a structural tension. Funds need safeguards and oversight, but they also need mechanisms that do not exclude the actors most capable of tailoring adaptation to local conditions. That means more effective direct access pathways, better support for local partners, clearer local delivery frameworks, and a more realistic appreciation of subnational implementation capacity. This slide links climate finance to social protection. Social protection matters because resilience is not only about infrastructure and ecosystems. It is also about livelihoods, income security, coping capacity, and the ability to absorb shocks without falling deeper into vulnerability. In many contexts, social protection systems can support adaptation by protecting households during climate stresses, reducing risk exposure, and creating room for longer-term adaptive choices. The deck notes that this is especially relevant where private finance is unlikely to invest, because the benefits are public, social, and long-term rather than immediately profitable. The GCF evidence suggests there are both opportunities and constraints in financing social protection-related interventions. The larger lesson is that adaptation finance should not be imagined narrowly. If the aim is just resilience, then financial design needs to consider not only physical assets but also the social systems that shape vulnerability and adaptive capacity. For planners, the most constructive question is how to integrate climate finance into decision-making rather than treating it as an external opportunity that appears after a plan is written. The slide proposes a sequence. Start with risk by analyzing hazards, exposure, vulnerability, and critical services. Then translate priorities into an investable pipeline with clear outcomes, realistic implementation arrangements, and appropriate safeguards. Align projects with national strategies such as NDCs, adaptation plans, and sector plans so that proposals are not isolated from the wider policy framework. Build readiness through better data, stakeholder processes, institutional partnerships, and proposal development capacity. And design for maintenance and long-term benefits rather than focusing only on initial approval. When proposals are coherent, evidence-based, and strategically aligned, transaction costs can fall and long-term value can rise. Good planning is therefore part of climate finance effectiveness. The ethical dimension returns forcefully here. Equity means prioritizing those with the greatest vulnerability and the least responsibility for climate change. Participation means more than consultation. It means meaningful engagement of affected communities in shaping priorities and implementation. Safeguards are necessary because climate projects can also generate environmental and social risks if poorly designed. Accountability requires results frameworks, monitoring systems, and learning loops so that finance is not judged only by approval volume. But the slide also gives an important warning. If procedures are designed for high-capacity actors and remain inaccessible to weaker institutions or marginalized groups, then fairness becomes performative. A system can speak the language of justice while reproducing exclusion through its operational rules. Ethical analysis must therefore include process design, not only stated principles. The synthesis slide distills the literature into 5 design principles. First, strengthen ownership by resourcing NDAs, building transparent national pipelines, and aligning finance with national plans. Second, reduce friction by streamlining requirements, right-sizing safeguards, and supporting proposal development where capacity is weak. Third, enable local delivery by improving direct access, clarifying what local delivery means, and creating incentives for stronger local partnerships. Fourth, build justice into design by using vulnerability metrics transparently and monitoring who is excluded from access and implementation. Fifth, link finance to livelihoods by integrating resilience objectives with social protection where appropriate. These principles show that the problem is not simply funding volume. It is also how finance is structured, who can navigate it, and whether systems are designed to work under conditions of uneven institutional capacity. To conclude, climate finance should be understood as governance. Rules shape outcomes, and procedural design shapes equity. The Green Climate Fund is a central institution in this landscape, but access depends heavily on institutions, intermediaries, and readiness conditions. The evidence suggests that vulnerability targeting exists, yet remains imperfect and constrained by capacity. Distributive justice is therefore only partially realized. Country ownership matters because durable transformation requires alignment with domestic strategies, stronger accountability, and institutional learning. Local delivery matters because adaptation only works when it reaches real exposure contexts and responds to local conditions. Finally, planning matters because well-prepared, risk-informed, and strategically aligned proposals can reduce transaction costs and improve justice by design. The larger lesson is that effective adaptation finance requires not only higher commitments, but better access design, stronger capacity, and closer attention to who is still excluded. As a final reflection, the key challenge for climate finance governance is not only mobilizing larger sums, but making sure that access conditions, allocation rules, and delivery systems are proportionate to the realities of vulnerability. If finance reaches countries and communities only when they already have strong institutions, then the architecture risks rewarding readiness more than need. For that reason, better climate finance requires more than technical reform. It requires attention to justice, institutional support, and planning capacity from the global scale down to the local one. That is also why the Green Climate Fund remains such an important case. It shows both the promise of climate finance reform and the persistent barriers that still shape who benefits in practice.